we both want to keep working as long as people are going to want to have us have us around. I suppose there'll be a point in time where nobody wants us around anymore, and we'll be too old, and time to quit altogether, and then we'll just do podcasts, I guess, after that.
You are listening to Manager Brothers Lessons Learned. Twice each month, Gregg and Jae draw on their combined 80-plus years of state and local government work experience to help listeners avoid the pitfalls they and others have unwittingly stumbled into. And now, on to the episode.
Well, Jay, what I thought we would do for this first episode is to start by talking about why we're doing this. What is this podcast all about? What is it that we hope to achieve in doing this? Besides just having fun, which was part of the motivation for our working together in any case. But let's talk about what your ideas and my ideas are for what we want to achieve with something called Lessons Learned.
Well, our initial discussion, we talked about what not to do, but kind of excluded that because lessons learned seems to be more appropriate because, as our father would tell us, even something that was negative, keep in mind what you've learned from this, and then try not to repeat your mistakes if that's the case. But certainly there are other extenuating circumstances that impact events that we've experienced in our roles as municipal managers.
Right.
So, while some of those are learning from our mistakes and what not to do, everybody makes mistakes. So I think where lessons learned comes in is more appropriate. And there's certainly a lot of positive things that happen in our careers as municipal managers. Otherwise, nobody would go into this line of work.
Yeah, and I think the other side of it is something that I have certainly tried to do, which is to, over the course of my career in dealing with younger managers or those newer to the profession, is to help them avoid some of the mistakes that I've made. And that's certainly some value in that. So some of the lessons that I've learned are things that I really feel like I have an obligation to pass on to other municipal managers that I come into contact with, and that was a lot of the learning that took place for me as I was becoming a city manager, to hang around with the people I used to refer to as the old guys, and listen to them tell stories, and some of those things I certainly kept filed away in my mind, so I would know not to do some of the things that they had done and learned from, or to repeat those things that worked out well for them.
Well, and I've encouraged other managers as well to take advantage of the resources that are out there. We all know are managers who tend to isolate themselves for whatever reason. You may not see them regularly at conferences or conventions. You may not see them post anything on the manager's listserv that we have in Michigan, and those are certainly useful tools. So that's where I would say if their preference is to use other avenues to gain some experience or whatever, hopefully this podcast will serve as part of that purpose.
Yeah, and there's, in this day and age, I think that there are people who find podcasts or similar kinds of programming their preferred way to gain information. When I was doing some interim management work at different times, I started to do my weekly report to the council as a video report, and I got very positive feedback on that. I think that many of the people that I was communicating with found that to be a better way in which they could gain information. And so it's one of those things where people have different learning styles, and so some people are going to pick it up in different ways, but I think so this is maybe just one more avenue for people to maybe gain some of that information.
Yeah, and I would give us some credit for at our age kind of embracing the technology anyway, because I've struggled with things, where I want to say much younger managers coming into this profession who have grown up with all of the social media and technology and what have you. There's some benefit certainly there to understand that they use those tools that we may not necessarily take full advantage of ourselves.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I have known managers who really do struggle with some of the technology. I confess that in terms of technology that I never learned to use, the fax machine was the one that I always had to have somebody else send faxes for me. Now, thankfully, that's almost never required. So I don't, that was a skill set that was short-lived in terms of its utility to me as a manager. But other than that, all of the rest of the technology, I found that I needed to know it and needed to learn how to use it, and so this is certainly another piece of that. So, and that may be an important lesson for those who are tuning in to listen to this is our first podcast. So we're going to learn some things about how to do this and do this well, hopefully, as we go along here.
Right.
So we, a little bit of the history here in terms of how we came to the idea of putting together a podcast. You and I had both been at a conference, and we're having a conversation afterwards at a family gathering where we talked about the fact that maybe some of those sessions could have been a bit more engaging for the audience, that we had found that some of them were a little bit on the boring side. And of course, you and I, being so close in age to one another, growing up together, developing our senses of humor, always have looked for ways in which we could inject humor in any of the conversations we were having. And so I think you suggested that we should put together a conference session that would be a little bit lighter in orientation, and that was where I think the idea of what not to do was your original suggestion for what we would call that. And I will certainly confess that there are some of the things we'll be talking about over the course of doing this podcast that will indicate that neither of us was necessarily the brightest when it came to how we approach some things. That's a part of lessons learned. But that was certainly one of the original thoughts was, put together a conference session and then decided that, maybe we just ought to expand it into a podcast and do the same thing, but extend it out, do it every couple of weeks and see if we couldn't sustain that for longer than one conference.
Right, and I think there's some advantage with you and I being brothers. I mean, I know this was covered at a recent convention that we were both at. I think there were at some point 3 sets of brothers that were identified that were in the municipal management arena anyway, and we were one of those 3 pairs. But
in Michigan, that is in Michigan.
In Michigan, right, yeah. Right. So growing up together and seeing how our sense of humor has developed and our personalities have developed, and certainly how we've come about this career in 2 different avenues, I think has some advantages in our perspectives on, when we start discussing the lessons learned.
Right. Yeah. I think the other thing that sort of inspired me, and I shared with you, was the idea that because we are manager brothers, that the example that was set by Click and Clack, the Tappet brothers from Car Talk program, was certainly something that I had in mind, and I think that it sets a good example for in a very, very different kind of profession. Now we'll have to see whether people think that we're as hilarious as the Car Talk brothers, but that remains to be seen. Well, let's talk a little bit about maybe some of the issues that we think we might take on here, or at least the types of issues. I think that There are a range of experiences that you and I have had, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second, talk a little bit about our backgrounds, but I think there's a range of experiences that we have had where we either have ourselves been involved with a particular issue where we might have concluded or did conclude that we could have done it better had we thought about issues that had not occurred to us as we were going through it. In some cases, there are things that are just outside of our control, and we don't really learn about them until after the fact, and those are kind of wish we'd known that going in sort of thing. And then there are certainly experiences that others have had that we're aware of, and that knowledge of what other colleagues have done is all plays into what we hope to highlight here in terms of how we want to tell those stories.
Yeah, I agree. I as you're talking, I was thinking back about, what attitudes I had for my first assignment, let's say, and how that developed. And then as I went into my subsequent assignments, the different thoughts that come about. I mean, some of the things, from a standpoint of a contract and what should be included in that, and relationships with councils. So there's certain things that you learn through those experiences, certainly.
Yeah, and I think the other side of it is that we might be able to shorten the learning curve for others too. I'm certainly not the manager that I was when I started more than 40 years ago. You develop a different skill set. You become more proficient at the skills that you have. And you also, I think, learn to kind of put yourself and what you do in a little bit broader perspective in terms of the things that seemed tremendously important at one moment in time, after a little bit of the passage of time, don't seem quite so important. And one of the lessons that I've learned, and we'll certainly talk about that, I think, as we go along here, is not to take myself too seriously. That's a lesson that took me longer to learn than what it could have, and I think that made it such that I drove myself nuts and drove other people nuts around me because I was, being way too serious about my own performance. The work you do need to take seriously. You don't have to take your own self seriously, I think.
We'll return to Manager Brothers' lessons learned in a moment. Do you have a topic you would like Gregg and Jae to explore? Are you interested in being a guest on Lessons Learned? Do you have comments about this episode? You can write Gregg and Jae using the contact form at greggllc.com/lessons. That's greggllc.com/lessons.
Well, let's talk just a little bit about background then. I think this is a good segue into that. I'll start and just indicate that I had graduated with a Master of Public Administration that included an internship in a local government, and from that moved into a variety of assignments as city manager over some 40 years, and then left full-time city management work in 2020 and have done 4 interim assignments since that time, and all of that work has been in Michigan, which is where I grew up. So your path was a little bit different, and I've said to you and to others that I don't know what I did to make you think that city management would be a good second career, but you can talk about that as well. You started out going to work for the state of Michigan.
Yeah, so it was certainly a different path than you took. Perhaps I was really anxious to get out of college after my bachelor's degree, but I took a Michigan civil service exam, which eventually got me a position with what is now the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, and I was there 32 years in 2 different counties. The initial part of that job, I guess I learned investigative and negotiation skills, certainly. And then as I moved, over the years, moved into a lower management position, took a lot of responsibility for developing local services contracts and monitoring and what have you that went along with contracts, but has very little to do with how I got into this profession. What really happened was on my own time. I had moved to Blissfield when my wife and I got married anyway, and we purchased a fixer-upper, and then 4 years later built a brand new house also in Blissfield. So I became a familiar face around the village office there, obtaining permits and dealing with inspections and having a variety of complaints, you might say, against an incompetent building inspector that we had at the time. But anyway, whatever prompted them, they had a vacancy on the planning commission and invited me to submit a letter of interest, which I did. And so I was appointed to the planning commission, which I served on for 3 years. 2 as the chairperson, and then I must have done a phenomenal job there. Some of the same people ask if I might consider running for a trustee position on village council, so that would have been an elected position. So I, along with several other members of the planning commission, kind of swept on to village council all at the same time. So there were 4 of us that had worked together on planning commission. So I served 2 years as a trustee, and the village president, who had been elected at the same time as I was elected to my trustee position, decided not to run for a second term, thought that I should run for village president, which I did. One election, one re-election, and a few years later. Well, anyway, in the course of this whole process, it dawned on me that while I was still working for state government for all those years, state government is a lot like, pounding your head against the wall, and perhaps I'm a slow learner, but it took me a while to realize that the wall wasn't moving. All I was doing was bruising my head by beating it against the wall. So by my experience with the planning commission and city or village council, it really became apparent to me that the local government is kind of where the rubber hits the road. You really get to see how things work and be able to make a difference. And I think that's really important factor in any career is seeing where you can make a difference. So it prompted me to decide after 30 years to go back to school and obtain my Master of Public Administration, which I did at the same time that I decided to then retire from the state of Michigan.
Well, let me interrupt you for just a second, Jay. Why I'm curious, and I haven't asked you this question before, so we're all going to hear this at the same time, I think. But why? I understand certainly the attraction of local government, but what was the attraction of being a local government administrator? You could have retired from the state and still continued to, to serve in an elected capacity.
I just felt like, I wanted to, I could have continued working for state government, certainly, but I had decided at that point, having had a taste, I guess, of what local government was about and working with, my appointed and elected positions, working with the village administrator there, that I kind of liked the thought of an encore career, doing that kind of administration. Because again, going back to my state government level, the last 20 years was in a lower level administrative position. So I had that administration mentality, I guess I want to say. Mm-hmm. So that was what prompted me to do that, and it was certainly not an easy decision because I was certainly apprehensive about going back to school at the age of 50. Mm-hmm. to obtain my master's degree. Or actually, I was older than 50 because my cohort was 30 years younger than I was. But
Right.
That was a very positive experience. I have to say that the whole experience was very, very positive.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and and just in terms of making that shift from being an elected official and going into administration at the local government level, us long-term managers refer to that as coming over from the dark side, which may reflect that tension that exists between elected officials and appointed officials maybe at all levels, but certainly at the local government level. And it's that's always done tongue in cheek, but it's reflective of the fact that there are very different perspectives there. And so I guess I would ask that question, Jay. We haven't really talked. I'll give you a chance to finish up with your background in a second here, but did you as you went through your master's program and you began to then work as an administrator, did you find that your perspective changed?
Having worked in the assignments that were all intentionally in small communities, that was my preference. Each of those communities is vastly different from the others. You just have different personalities and different issues and different community, the public that's involved and what have you. So there are challenges, certainly, and we'll probably talk about this in future podcast. Dealing with elected officials, was unique. I want to say in each of the assignments that I had. And you've heard me talk about one of those assignments, and you would think that after having experienced that, I might have just decided to retire from doing anything and stay home or whatever. But I recognized that was kind of a unique situation. But it was one of those lessons learned that I took with me at the next assignment then on how I was going to what kind of relationship I wanted to have or look for in working with other elected officials.
Yeah, and it's interesting while you were talking about that, and I certainly am familiar with that situation. We'll get to that, as I say, in a subsequent episode. But I was at a meeting, a regional managers group meeting here last week, and there was a conversation about the nature of what that relationship with elected officials, the expectations of the public, how those have changed over the course of my career. And one of the people who was there, somebody I've known for a long, long time, said, would you do it again? Would you go into this line of work knowing what you know now and knowing what the environment is like right now? And my answer to that was absolutely. I would do this again, mainly because it was the challenge of this work that always inspired me. And I think that that's probably, you can comment on that as well. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the fact that I've said, if this job were easy, everyone would want to do it. It's the fact that it is difficult but important work that inspires me to keep doing those kinds of things. And and we may well talk about the fact that in the future, I was forced to resign a position after 17 years in the same community. And so those things happen. And while I originally thought that might be the last manager's job I held, I ended up in another one and served another 13 years before finally deciding that it was time to do a little bit of consulting and find a little time for myself. But I think that's a part of the message that I would share with anyone, is that this is, it's important that there are people like you and me who have chosen to do this work and chosen to do it even when it's hard.
Well, I think that it's important to emphasize that we enjoy the work, we enjoy the challenges that go with this work. Having worked in a job while I was obtaining my bachelor's degree in a factory where you punched a time clock, these positions as municipal managers are nothing like that as far as punching a time clock. If you're looking for something that has this, the same duties and same product, I guess, on an everyday basis, and it's going to be 8 to 5 Monday through Friday, this is probably not the profession for you, because it's not going to be that cut and dry. But that's the beauty of it, is that these challenges oftentimes are unique, and I like finding solutions. That's part of, maybe it goes back to my initial work with state government, when I mentioned developing negotiation skills. I don't mean negotiation from the standpoint of contracts, but just negotiation from the standpoint of working with people.
Right.
And every person and every situation is totally different.
Well, so I cut you off. I think that you were going to finish up your story by talking about the fact that you spent 10 years then in 3 different communities as a manager.
Yes, and as an encore career, when I went into this, it was my intent to work at it only for 10 years. I mean, I really didn't want to continue working full time, beyond that point, having worked already for state government for 32 years. So again, just with government, 42 years, full time seemed like enough. And I probably failed to mention that in between retiring from state government and obtaining my first assignment as a manager, I taught as an adjunct professor at 2 community colleges, taught government, just a few classes anyway, just to get a different perspective and keep in touch, I guess, until I obtained that first assignment. Mm-hmm. So it was intentional that I was going to stay just 10 years. So my last assignment was somewhat more than 7 years. If I had stayed 3 more years, I would have been vested in another retirement system. But I stuck to my original plan, and it seemed appropriate at the time that I was going to leave voluntarily, after those 7 years. And That was at the end of a 10-year period. So at this point, what I'm hoping to do is continue to be involved as an interim manager or consultant, and those are the 2 things. I again don't plan to have any permanent full-time position.
Yeah, and I think for the benefit of listeners, worth pointing out at this point that you and I are partners in a consulting firm doing interim management and other kinds of things, and I set that up in 2020, and then you joined earlier this year. To be able to continue to do that, which is good an indication as any that we both want to keep working as long as people are going to want to have us around. I suppose there'll be a point in time where nobody wants us around anymore, and we'll be too old and time to quit altogether, and then we'll just do podcasts, I guess, after that. But
right.
Well, I want to wrap up here and answer the question that we get asked more than any other, which is how we pronounce our last name. Try not to pronounce all the letters you see in the way that you think they ought to be pronounced.
I always tell people to think in German, because that's the origin of our last name, but that doesn't seem to help oftentimes.
There aren't many German speakers out there.
No, apparently not. And it was interesting. I always think back to when I was obtaining my bachelor's degree, and your first day of each class, the professors would always go through the enrollment list and read off last names. And it was it's so funny, because after the first time it happened, and it would repeat itself nearly every class, they would go Adams and whatever in order, and they would get to the G and they would just say J. They wouldn't even try the last name. So it was funny, but. Anyway, so I always told them, think good show, say it fast enough, and it comes out pretty darn close to how we pronounce it.
I tell people, like, I went to the movie and I saw a good show, or I went to the theater and I saw a good show. So I think that my favorite college story related to name pronunciation has to do with my political theory professor when I was an undergrad, who was one of the old school types who addressed all of the students as Mr. or Miss. And so when he would call on me, he would say, Mr. Getschov, thinking that apparently I was Russian. And he would say, is that how it's pronounced? No, it's Gucho. And then he would, the next class period, it was Mr. Getzjob again. Is that how it's pronounced? No, it's Goodchow. And after about 3 or 4 times, I just gave up, and I was Mr. Getzjob for the remainder of that class term. Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And speaking of our name, and this is probably unique to me anyway, but my first name, of course, is 3 letters. My middle name is 3 letters, and our last name is 9 letters. So I learned before I went to kindergarten to spell my name in increments of 3 letters.
Right.
And here we are at a much later age. I still do that when I spell my name. So some things you just can't unlearn.
Now that's funny because I know that our mother used to spell it that way,
Right.
and the last name. I don't do that. I do the first 4 letters, G-U-E-T, and then I pause and draw out the S, because a lot of people are going to hear F or something else before I get to the
Right.
last 4 letters. So I tend to do it in 4, 1, and 4, but that's just a difference in how we've learned how to communicate that to others. Well, as we're wrapping up here, I think one of the things that I want to make sure to point out is that while we're certainly have lots of plans for what we want to do with this, one of the things that we're going to offer is that for others in our line of work who have lessons that they've learned, that we'll have an opportunity for them to join us on one of these podcasts as well, and we'll provide some information here as we go along as to how to contact us and maybe arrange to come on and have a chat with us and have some fun doing that. So.
Well, and anyone that doesn't want to necessarily, be on the podcast itself, but they have certain issues that they would like to hear us discuss, they can certainly contact us, and we can discuss that with them, offline, I guess you want to say.
Right.
And certainly between the two of us, whatever issues they bring up, one of us is certainly experienced in, the 80 plus years that we've worked in public service.
Yeah, and we'll a little later on here toward the end, we'll give an email or a URL where people can connect to a contact form so that they can communicate with us. That'll be the best way to get in touch with us as we go along. Well, kind of looking ahead to our next episode, what I want to focus on is a specific example where I learned the importance of testing an idea before rolling it out, and we'll talk about how that happened and what the lessons were that were learned from that, and how not to repeat that going forward. So we'll talk again soon.
All right, very good. Have a good day.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you for listening today. We hope you enjoyed the show. Manager Brothers Lessons Learned is a production of Gregg Guidance, LLC, a multi-specialty consulting firm offering interim management, group process facilitation, workflow analysis, operational studies, and more to local governments in Michigan and beyond.